Dreamscape presents The Ghost Manuscript by Chris Frieswick, narrated by Carrington McDuffie. Thursday, June 21st. The pain pierced Karis Jones's abdomen, and every other sensation she'd been feeling was consumed. Gone was the hard coldness that had seeped into her core, the unexpectedly deafening sound of her own breath, the confusion of the black water that surrounded her, the throbbing in her ears. Her body drew into a fetal position, and she held her breath. She pinched her eyes shut and held perfectly still. If I don't move, the pain might stop, she thought. Please stop. Karis began to drop through the darkness. Then something grabbed one of her shoulders and spun her around. A red light filled her closed lids. She raised her hands to push it away, but hands grabbed hers, and the light faded quickly. She slowly opened her eyes. David stared back through a wall of silvery bubbles, his forehead furrowed behind his mask. He jutted his thumb up. Surface now. She could not move. David held her hand and began to kick slowly, towing her back the way they'd come, out of the cave, back to the surface. For an instant, it was all she wanted, to lie down and unfold and die on land. She almost looked forward to it. Then a thought broke through the pain. In. She tentatively inhaled, then exhaled. The pain eased slightly. The word came again into her mind, louder, more insistent. In. She took another shallow breath and squeezed David's hand. He turned back to look at her. She shook her head and pointed behind. In. I want to go in. It's there. I know it is. He sharply jutted his thumb up twice. The dive is over. Uncurling, Karis threw off his hand, turned around, and swam. Each kick of her legs shot the pain higher up, into her arms and shoulders, but she would not stop, even if it killed her. They were so close. David grabbed her fin to stop her. She slipped out of his grasp and kicked harder. She pointed her flashlight out in front of her, where its long, thin beam hit nothing but the tiny fish, fleeing the light, and sea matter suspended like dust in the water. There were no cave walls anymore, just blackness and water. There was no up or down, left or right, or upside down. It did not matter as long as she was going in, away from the cave mouth, away from David. She wasn't going to stop. It had to be here. She beat her legs up and down and searched the darkness with useless eyes. Suddenly, Karis's head emerged out of the water into cool air. She ripped the regulator out of her mouth and gasped. The air was stale and tangy on her tongue, but it was oxygen. She inflated her diving vest. Her legs dangled in the water beneath her as she pulled off her mask. She strained to see something, anything. There was only blank space. She tried to relax, but her entire body felt like stone. Then, all at once and completely, the pain subsided as quickly as it had come. David surfaced next to her and pulled the regulator out of his mouth. He pointed his flashlight at her. "What's wrong?" he said, his voice high and scared. "I'm okay," she said, steadying herself with her hands on his shoulders. "I'll be okay." "We have to get you back out," he said. "What's happening?" "I don't know," she said. "Whatever it was, it's done." David's face clouded over. Karis was breaking every diving rule ever written, and he was angry. Rightfully so, she was endangering them both, again. But tonight, none of the rules applied, and they both knew it. His face softened. He turned away and raised his flashlight to examine the space they were in. It was a vast cavern, a cathedral of stone with walls 30 feet high. Yellow and red stalactites, like long, thin statues of the saints, hung down from the ceiling, some extending through the surface of the water. David turned and swept the beam of the light behind him. Carved into the wall of the cavern, clearly made by human hands, was an enormous niche, like the ones built into the walls of churches to display statues of the Virgin Mary and the Apostles. This one was much bigger, 10 feet high at least, and another 10 deep. In it, dirty white and ruggedly chiseled, lay a stone sarcophagus. An ancient Christian cross had been etched into the side facing them. "Oh my God," said David, his voice barely a whisper. "It's here." Part 1. Boston. Chapter 1. Friday, June 8th. The sight of the envelope on Karis's desk set her left eyelid twitching. Her name and work address were hand-printed on the center of it in small, compact letters, set in unnaturally straight lines. It could have been her own writing. When Karis was 13, she'd tried to change how she wrote so it didn't look like this. She had tried flowery and sloppy, loopy with slashes, exaggerated crosses and dots, and sloping angles. None of it took for very long. Her handwriting still looked just like her father's. She stared at the letter for a couple of minutes. She sipped her coffee and wondered why he was still trying. The eyelid twitching got worse. She turned the envelope over on its face and slid it away. She'd toss it out later. "Karis," said Janice from the adjoining desk. Karis looked over, and Janice notched her chin toward their boss's glass-walled office. The room usually resembled a shaken snow globe. Today, George Plourd's papers were organized, and there was only one mug on his desk. He'd cleared the floor of the crumpled paper, the stack of extra ties and shoes, his collection of obsolete charging cables, and his ratty briefcase. Plourd sat at his desk, his back rigid and his face frozen in a smile. Or what she assumed was a smile beneath the tangled mass of his salt and pepper beard. A bald man sat across from him. "Who's that?" asked Karis. "Martin Giles," said Janice. "What?" "I know," said Janice. "What's he doing in Plourd's office?" Janice shrugged. "How do you know it's him? I thought he was never photographed." "Art and Auction got one," said Janice. "He was in the background in a photo of a crowd at a British Library exhibition. I recognized him when he came in this morning." Karis stared at the back of the man's shiny head. "How long has he been in there?" she asked. "About half an hour," said Janice. Martin Giles rose, slid open Plourd's door, and strode toward the elevator. He was 5'7" or 8", but looked taller in his tailored navy suit, made of a fabric that moved like water over his muscular shoulders. Beneath his left French cuff, a gold watch glinted. Giles pushed the elevator button and turned to survey the office. His eyes connected with Karis's. She almost looked away, but found herself holding his gaze. She nodded a hello. He was not good-looking, not even close. Slightly bulging eyes, thick eyebrows, and not much of a chin. Yet he was confident, holding himself as if he owned the company. He probably could if he wanted to. He was likely worth a fortune. He did not blink or look away. She broke the gaze first. The elevator door opened, and Giles, the leading cultural antiquities repatriation expert in the world, the man who had returned more stolen treasures to their owners and countries of origin than anyone else in history, turned and stepped into it. When the elevator door closed, Karis shot Janice a puzzled glance. "White whale," said Janice. Karis's email notification pinged. She slid aside a stack of private collection catalogs and 19th century English gilt-edged psalm books that blocked the computer screen. "Come see me," the email said. She closed her eyes, inhaled, and exhaled. "Time for my morning ogling," she said. "Find out what Giles was doing here," said Janice. Karis pulled her shoulder-length black hair behind her ears, buttoned her cardigan all the way up to her neck, and draped a scarf around her angular shoulders and full chest. "Good morning, Miss Jones, good morning," Plord said as he waved her in, glancing at her breasts. "Good morning," she said. She sat down and crossed her arms. What was Martin Giles doing here? Plord's dull eyes sparked. He opened his mouth to speak, then closed it, shuffled some papers from one side of his desk to the other, and looked back at Karis. "We had some business matters to discuss," said Plord. "What business?" she said. "We got an interesting call a couple of days ago," said Plord. "There's a collection I want you to look at. The owner is indisposed indefinitely, and his son is selling the family home and wants the books sold as soon as possible. I need you to head out to the house and confirm the catalog, evaluate condition, appraisal estimates, the usual. You can start today. You'll probably be there a week or two. We're doing a private sale on this one, not an auction." Karis's eye twitch got worse. She normally reviewed manuscript collections at Southington's auction house, where she'd worked for nearly a decade, or in private warehouses. She did not like to do appraisals or authentications in the owner's home. People were messy, especially rich, obsessive book people. The last time she'd been in the home of a collector, an inbred Boston Brahmin with no China Pinckney Street address, family portraits by Jenny's on the wall, and a pair of khakis that looked and smelled like he'd been wearing them for 2 years straight, the man had spent 3 hours bent over her while she worked, trying to convince her that his Shakespeare First Folio of Romeo and Juliet was authentic. It was not. She did not like people interfering with her process. That was just between her and the books. "Send Jim," said Karis. "I'm busy." "No, you're most familiar with the collection," said Plord. "Whose is it?" "John Harper's." She blinked. A smile formed within Plord's beard. "Well, he's not selling it. As I said, the son is." He leaned across the desk slightly, and the cloying scent of his musky, cinnamon-tinged aftershave invaded her nostrils and started her eyes watering. "Harper's been committed to Wagner Psychiatric Hospital in Belmont. He's gone quite insane," he said. Karis's hands went cold. "His son, John Jr., or JJ, or whatever he goes by, has power of attorney," said Plord. "The doctors don't know when or if Harper will be coming home, and JJ wants the books gone. Here's the catalog." He handed Karis a black hardcover moleskin notebook. She opened it, but she already knew what was in it. Page after page of handwritten notes, details on the books in the Harper collection, the finest collection of British Dark Age manuscripts on Earth. She had located and authenticated many of these books for Harper, and they were like beloved ancient relatives, wizened and wise, and keeping their secrets. They had been resurrected at great cost, and often great peril, from vaults and monasteries, caves and cathedral walls, war loot stashes and other forbidden places, and pulled into the present, one by one, from the most illiterate era since the birth of Christ, and they all live now in Harper's home in Wellesley. As she paged through the catalog, the smell of Plord's aftershave drifted away, and her eyelids stopped twitching. "Jesus, you're ugly," mumbled Karis. The huge gargoyle door knocker on the front door of Adiona, John Harper's sprawling Greek Revival mansion, stared back at her. Its black wrought-iron beard, wild eyes, and fanged, sneering mouth dared her to reach out and knock. It was out of place on the house, an architectural anachronism, inappropriate aesthetically and historically. Not a mistake, though, she was sure of that. If she knew Harper, this was a replica of a gargoyle on a church or cathedral built during the Dark Ages, somewhere in the British Isles. Or maybe it was an original. Her breath caught briefly at the idea, and she leaned in to inspect the gargoyle more carefully. The door swung open. She jumped back. "You must be Karis," said the man who opened it. He was a good 6 inches taller than her, which was unusual. She rarely had to look up at men. His tousled bird's nest of blonde hair belonged to a much younger person, not the mid-40ish ones standing